So in our previous lessons, we talked about Spain before 1492, and we also talked a little bit about the Black Legend and how that kind of developed over time. It was self-inflicted, but it also, led to stereotypes about Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the U.S. Southwest. So, I want to talk about how that stereotype developed. And the goal of this lesson, I'm not trying to deny colonial violence, and that's not what we're trying to do. But I want to show how selective storytelling and repetition turned an anti-empire narrative into racialized common sense over time. So you are going to notice some overlap from the previous lesson. So you'll notice some of these learning goals. It's like, but we've already talked about that. You're right, we're just expanding on what we've already learned about the Black Legend. So we're going to explain a little bit more about how it developed and spread, shorter version this time. Describe how anti-Spanish narratives shifted into anti-Mexican stereotypes after 1821. That's an important date. Connect the Black Legend to U.S. expansion and the Mexican-American War that happened in the 1840s. Identify how stereotypes shape land, law, labor, and education in the Southwest. And then also throughout this, we have some check-in points. So we're going to practice some historical thinking when we look at sourcing, context, corroboration, and then also just omission of things. So what we're looking at is stereotypes, how they appear. They just don't appear out of nowhere, right? They have to come from somewhere. And in this case, when we hear stereotypes about Mexicans in the U.S. Southwest, ideas that frame Mexican people as lazy or violent, backward, corrupt, or incapable of self-government, it can sometimes feel like those ideas have always existed. But in reality, we know that they haven't. And these stereotypes, they do have a history, one that we've talked about. And one of the most important origins is the Black Legend that we talked about previously. So this is a little bit of a review. You already know this, right? The Black Legend began as a tradition of anti-Spanish propaganda in early modern Europe. And as you will recall, it portrayed Spain and Spaniards as cruel, fanatical, backward, and oppressive compared to their European counterparts like the English, the Dutch, and the French. And over time, the story was repeated so often in little flyers or pamphlets that were sent out, political writings, textbooks, and popular culture that it stopped feeling like propaganda and started just to feel like common sense after a while. That's one of the most important ideas to remember today is how propaganda becomes powerful when repetition makes it feel natural and unquestioned over time. So, moving from that empire to everyday stereotypes. So at first, the Black Legend, it was about empire. It criticized Spanish imperial rule, especially Spain's actions in the Americas, but over time, that criticism didn't stay focused on the Spanish Empire as a political system. Instead, it became very racialized. And the story shifted from Spain as a cruel empire to Spaniards as cruel people, and eventually to broader ideas about people connected to Spanish language and culture. In that shift, it does matter because it laid the groundwork for later stereotypes in the U.S. So, and as historians or just people who are interested in history, you have to consider the following. When you hear a sweeping claim about a whole group, ask who benefits from the story and what's being left out, right? So, why are we making these sweeping accusations about an entire group of people? And what things are we leaving out? Whose story does it fit? Whose narrative does it fit? And why are they spinning it that way? After Spain lost much of its empire and Mexico became independent in 1821, the Black Legend doesn't disappear. It was just transferred to a different group of people now. So in U.S. thinking, older anti-Spanish ideas are applied to Mexico and Mexican people. And Mexico was often portrayed as a failed or a chaotic nation, inherently corrupt or violent, incapable of governing itself, and culturally inferior to Anglo-American society. And these portrayals, they were not neutral descriptions of reality. They recycled those old Black Legend narratives and applied them to a new target. And this is how political propaganda story becomes a racial stereotype. And here, think about a stereotype often works like a shortcut story, right? It explains complex events by blaming a culture or a people instead of examining power, economics, and conquest. This is a U.S. political cartoon. This is from 1913 to 1915, but if you notice, it says revolution, right? And it says progress is there in the background. It's the sun. We're running towards progress, but we're running on a treadmill, showing that we're never going to get there. So this is, again, anti-Mexican because you can tell like it's supposed to represent a Mexican with a big sombrero. The pistols, it kind of looks like Pancho Villa from like the back, like running towards progress, but it's like you're never going to get there because you're just running on a treadmill, right? And this is obviously, it talks about cultural backwardness, racial limitations, and then just how Americans, when we talk about Anglos, we're talking about white European descent, like from England, even Germany, but that very white culture, that Anglo culture. So I'm talking about how superior this Anglo culture is in this political cartoon. These ideas that go hand in hand with the stereotype, it really came especially powerful during the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848, or if you were living in Mexico at the time, it was called the War of American Aggression. And U.S. politicians, newspapers, and popular writers really often framed the war as a mission to bring order to chaos, a civilizing project, or a moral justification for expansion. Mexican society at the time was described as backward and mismanaged. So, and at the same time, U.S. expansion was framed as being progressive, democratic, and inevitable, right? Manifest destiny. It is our God-given right to expand our borders. And this narrative helped justify the U.S. takeover of large territories, including California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Nevada, and parts of Colorado and Utah. In reality, this is a word that we hate to hear in American society, but this is an example of colonial conquest. Right? So, but Black legend thinking helped make that conquest seem righteous instead of aggressive. So, how does calling conquest a civilizing project change how people judge violence and land seizure? Right? We are civilizing. We are bringing civilization. We are bringing our Christian moral superiority to these people who don't know any better. So, we're treating a whole group of people that are highly educated, highly talented, military-wise, very, capable, and we're calling them almost childlike. One, that's insulting to whomever we're doing it to. But also it changes how people who are not on the front lines dealing with it, it frames how they kind of picture it. Like, oh, this is like a people that are just backwards and easy to take over. We should come in and conquer them. We should show them what to do. And that story has been played out over and over and over and over in history, and I don't think we're done playing out that story in history. So this is a map showing you the territory that was gained by the U.S. at the end of the Mexican-American War. There's a treaty that's signed, and it's called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and it's signed in 1848. And because of that treaty, it's really, like, this area was already claimed by Texas, and here it's really all this other area, right? So these are all the lands that are given up by Mexico after that war and as part of that treaty. What's interesting is, and we'll get a little bit more into this if you guys would like to, you can send me a message and I'll be more than happy to go more into the Mexican-American War and the treaty itself. But in the treaty, part of that was if you decided to become a U.S. citizen, you got to keep your ancestral land. Because you have to remember, Spain had been in this part and had settled in like the early 1500s. They had been exploring this area. And so these ancestral homes had been in their family for over 250 years at this point that we're talking about. So for them to say, I want to give up and go to Mexico, go back across the Rio Grande, a lot of them are like, I don't want to give up my home that has been in my family 250, 300 years. And in the treaty, it said, you don't have to. You can keep your home. You just have to become a U.S. citizen. Very quickly after that treaty was signed, though, in true U.S. fashion, we don't uphold the treaty. And a lot of that land that was part of, Mexico and Mexican landholders, they lose that land. Whites come in and take over that land, and the treaty is not upheld. So that's something to keep in mind. We'll talk more about that as we move forward in this class. So, after the war, Mexicans, like I just said, they were granted that protection, but what ends up happening is they were treated as, untrustworthy landowners and naturally suited only for low-wage labor. And these assumptions justify like moving them off of their land, segregation schools, exclusion from political power, and racialized labor systems. These are not new ideas. Again, this stems from the Black legend, kind of recycled in order to support a U.S. racial hierarchy. So there is this common misconception. If a group loses land or political power, it must be because they were less capable. Why that is misleading is because power, law, violence, and unequal enforcement can produce inequality even when treaties promise rights. Here's a little bit of the treaty, just a photo of it, but you can go through and you can read it in English and in Spanish, the treaty, and you can see where all these protections were just not upheld by the U.S. government once the treaty was signed. So let's look at education, media, and popular culture really quickly. So these stereotypes about Mexicans didn't just stay in politics and law. They entered education, media, and also into mainstream popular culture. And Spanish and Mexican rule in the Southwest was often portrayed as corrupt, chaotic, or brutal towards indigenous peoples without comparison to U.S. violence. Anglo settlement, meanwhile, so white settlement, was framed as orderly and democratic and beneficial even when it involved displacement, violence, killing people, broken treaties, right? The one-sided storytelling taught generations of students to see Mexican history as a failure instead of as complex, diverse, and legitimate. Go back and think. Those of you that maybe aren't from Arizona, go back and think about when you were growing up and you learned about the colonies. I remember I learned about like the Spanish conquistadors and then nothing else about Spanish influence. The only thing I learned growing up in Texas was we lost at the Alamo and then we got payback later on and we defeated Santa Anna in Mexico. And although, that story was told over, that was really all I knew about Mexico and Mexico's empire was, they got beat. Nothing else about like this rich cultural heritage and how great this empire was. Not all of that is left out. All the Spanish influence of the Southwest is completely left out of history. Go back and think about it, because I bet most of it was left out of your education as well. So why does this still matter? This history matters because many modern stereotypes about Mexicans in the Southwest can be traced back to this very long process that's been happening for 500 years. Ideas about criminality, laziness, or cultural inferiority are not natural. They were built. And understanding the Black legend helps us see that prejudice is historically constructed, stereotypes serve political and economic goals, and history can be used to justify inequality. And the Black legend didn't just distort the past, but it also shaped the present. So our key takeaway, before you get to the quiz and the activity, stereotypes about Mexicans in the Southwest, again, they're not accidental. They're the result of centuries. I said, 500 years of old propaganda that shifted from the Spanish Empire into racialized ideas used to justify U.S. expansion and inequality. Well, they're just less than. They're not equal to Anglos, so that's why we can treat them as second-class citizens. We don't just do this with Mexicans, right? We do this with other groups as well. We do this to women. We do this to African Americans. We do this to, and I'm going to just make it the general broad term here, Latinos. And hopefully you guys know that I'm talking about like anyone that speaks Spanish in this case. So Latinos, and we do this also to immigrants. Anyone that is not white, we have these stereotypes that we use to justify why we treat them so poorly, why we treat them so badly. So as you're moving through this, keep that in mind. And once you're finished with this, you can move on to the quizzes and the activity.